I will admit that I didn't know what they were when they started popping up. Bumper stickers at that time were terse but decidedly grammatical, using at least some witty combination of words or a strategically placed verb to get a laugh. If you can read this, you're too close. Or, if history repeats itself, I'm getting a dinosaur. So I was puzzled when 26.2 started showing up on little stickers in the backs of cars, the bottom corners of rear windshields. I've always had a sort of awe of people who ran marathons, feeling somewhere in between admiration over an incredible accomplishment that takes real talent and determination, and incredulous that someone would go to the trouble of making the trip. You could always take a bus. You don't have to do it on foot. You must really, really want that complimentary coupon. No wonder that those who make it the full distance, those who run the full marathon, they want to place a little trophy somewhere that they will see it regularly, a point of pride. Although I think it's a little ironic to put a running sticker on the back of a car. It almost begs the question, did you run it or drive it? Because driving, I am not nearly as impressed. Years ago, I met someone at a wedding who ran marathons regularly. It was his vocation, what he loved to do, and seemed to put a great deal of time into thinking and reading and training for the task. I remember being surprised because he was a small person, not the tall and lanky physique I would have associated with a hobby runner. I didn't doubt he got lots of exercise. He was clearly in great shape, but not the picture of someone you'd see on the cover of a running magazine: bright hair, short limbs, a wide smile. I was intrigued when we talked about his running. He started describing it to me. It's incredible to me that anyone could bring themselves to train for a distance that long, but the way he described it, well, the experiences sounded a little different. It didn't sound like he was just spending a sunny afternoon on his trek. These were longer. Through the better course of a day, sometimes from early in the morning until very late at night. And he described not so much getting in the zone as entering a kind of trance, almost superhuman. How long was that run? I asked. That was a 50, but right now I'm working on an 100. 100 what? Is that like some new term I wasn't hip to? 100%? I was hoping he would say 100 feet. 100 miles, he said. I was shocked. I genuinely didn't know that was possible. I get tired driving 100 miles. And I'm not the car. It's the kind of trip I check my tire pressure for, and here was someone who did it on foot. How in the world? I couldn't help but ask all about it. It takes months of careful training. You work up to it after years of practice. My favorite tidbit was that he would buy a new pair of shoes for the ultra marathon, as it's called, and by the end he would have completely worn through the soles. But I remember one other thing very clearly. He described to me the time after the run with a bit of remorse. It takes me out for days, sometimes as much as a week, he said. After the run, I can't do anything. I have to just rest and recover. It would be safe to say that we have just come through a marathon. Not a sprint, as all of us came to realize as the temporary shutdown of March 2019 stretched its way beyond the anticipated initial few months, and made its way to marathon length as it cornered the year mark. We pushed and pushed. We put our lives on hold or reinvented them. We learned to go without the seemingly extra things that kept us in balance during our already and normally very demanding lives. And then we ran right into summer. And I think that was when many of us started breathing again. 6/15, that magic date, so nearly reminiscent of 613 commandments in the Torah, an icon of both overloaded capacity and profound accomplishment. And two more even than that. We went on vacation. We hugged family again and came back out into the wide, beautiful world. I'm proud we ran right through the finish line. And it was not easy. I remember talking to a colleague early in the pandemic about what it was like to run programming via Zoom. We traded ideas and challenges back and forth, shared tips for lifting the hood of the platform and finding better ways for the tech to help us communicate. A setting here, a new microphone. And I remember her saying something that surprised me. She said it took her a while to realize that one of the hardest parts of the new platform for users was the transitions. In person, there's usually a natural pause between sections of a program as one speaker walks away from the mic and the other ascends. Or people migrate from one room to another as an afternoon continues, but on Zoom you snap right from one to the other, instantaneous. I think filmmakers and editors know this. There has to be a moment for the eyes and the mind to breathe, to find their way into the next scene, and the very same way it takes time to transition out of the reality of the pandemic, just as it does to transition into it. We have been going and going from one thing to the next. Creating an office out of a corner of a room and moving our schoolhouses home and then back to school. We hosted programs online and then in person and then hybrid and then online again, changing and then changing again with remarkable resilience, snapping back and forth. And whereas we may have become accustomed to the constant change, it's not natural for our hearts and minds to constantly turn over like that. We need time to breathe, to transition. And here's the kicker. We thought we were running a marathon, hitting that 26-2 milestone and then picking up our ribbon and going home. But we're still going. I don't think there's any feeling quite like the one of raising up our hopes, seeing the end in sight, and then having our guts sink while we watch it draw further, not near. Thank God we have a vaccine that, according to the CDC and our own community health experts, significantly decreases the likelihood of negative effects of the virus, but a new variant is here. And our community is scared. By far, the majority of our congregation participated in services online on Rosh Hashanah. And for just about every person I spoke to, it was because of their family's needs due to the virus. Not to mention that those under 12 are not able to get the vaccine. We entered a 26-2 and discovered that we are in an ultramarathon. I first heard about Haruki Murakami from a friend in high school. He was a fairly literary guy, so when he mentioned a new author, my ears perked up. At the time, Murakami was a celebrated writer, but he hadn't launched into quite the popularity he enjoys today, where you can pick up his novels anywhere. Airport bookstores had his tome, IQ 84, spread out across their entryway tables for what seemed like months when it came out in 2011. Every once in a while, an author will grab me, and I'll read as many books of theirs as I can get a hold of. Much easier now with the internet, but it used to be a fun treasure hunt to travel to new bookstores in vacation cities and see if I could find an unread novel hidden away on a dusty shelf. The less popular, the rarer, the more satisfying to collect. And then tuck myself away and crawl through the lightly scuffed pages. He's a fiction writer. So I was surprised when I brought home a slim volume one day and discovered that it wasn't. It was almost a memoir. And while his voice was clearly there, it was a very different style than his other books. An entire book on running. Given that most of his work is on culture, relationships, loneliness, and the supernatural, it seemed a strange topic for him. But he realized one day that when people would ask him about his daily runs, his practice and periodic long-distance journeys, he couldn't say much, only that he ran. And when asked what this now iconic intellectual of the literary world thought about when he was on these sometimes hours-long journeys, he only said that he didn't think. Murakami noted that you can't understand and make sense of something when you are in the middle of it. So he sat down at his desk and wrote. In the flowing pages, he mused on the zone mind we are all too familiar with from hearing from athletes of all kinds, and the long-fought feeling of accomplishment brought on by endurance and careful focus, although in his way he describes it with the sky and the ocean. We have been on this run in this pandemic for so long, it would be safe to say that we have entered the zone or are so busy with the task that we are lost in it. But this is the time of the year when we stop and reflect on our lives, and few things have been more impactful than the pandemic. And perhaps the most difficult part is recognizing the unspeakable tragedy of lives lost. While most catastrophes happen all at once, this has been a shockingly slow and mundane one. Like most days, we go to work, check email, and walk the dog, but this year we have done so knowing that hundreds of thousands of lives are being lost, millions around the world. So I'd like to invite us to stop for a brief moment and recognize that. Last year, at the High Holy Days, I sadly shared that almost 200,000 people in the U.S. had died due to the virus. This year, that number is more than 650,000. Sometimes, and especially with death, there is nothing to say, but we mourn together. We will certainly look back and note things that could have been done differently and better, but today, I invite us simply to recognize and hold each other in grief. Murakami continues in his book, marveling over the act of taking a long journey on foot. Eventually, he betrays his underlying thoughts and muses on how taking on a long-distance run is similar to writing a novel. Advice for budding novelists and anyone with a long road ahead of them, and ever the mystic, he sets into his description of rhythm, how the pace of the world can be exemplified and accompanied by the gentle pounding of runners' feet on the path. Quote, "To keep on going, you have to keep up the rhythm. This is the important thing for long-term projects. Once you set the pace, the rest will follow," he writes. We have all found ourselves in the middle of a long trek, one that can't be shortened by increasing our speed, and so I invite us to rest and pace ourselves. I was frightened when I started my first 5K. I'd never done anything like that before, but I signed up on an invitational whim and knew that there was I knew there was a t-shirt involved, that's all. So I went home. I got changed and showed up for the start of the race a couple hours later, and when I arrived, they handed me a little flat fob that looked like a keychain without the ring. Someone told me to tie it into my shoelaces, so I did. The start of the race was a little chaotic as everyone crowded around the decorated archway that signed the beginning. The little shoe ornament turned out to be a tracker, so that they could stagger runners' beginnings through the small arch, but everyone could still compete for time. I'd also taken a look at the map of the run around downtown, but I wasn't very familiar with the area, so I had visions of missing a turn like Wile E. Coyote and running right past the route, stopping for directions at a gas station. But it was clearly marked. Even when other runners weren't present, it was easy to know the way. I knew about pacing and kept myself moving on an easy clock. So I was surprised when the end of the race came up. I'd expected this to be a real grueling experience, one that pushed me a little beyond my limits, but in truth, even after the race, I was still ready to go. It wasn't nearly as difficult as I had imagined. I'd been running for a little while by then, and it turned out the race wasn't so different than my weekly jaunt down to the public library and back. I wasn't going to win any awards, but I was happy. As it turns out, I was much more capable and resilient than I had imagined. And so here's the good news. We've already done this. We've already learned what pacing, what work, and what adjustments need to be made in order to be successful at navigating this pandemic. We know how to run this, and we know how to do that together. So all that remains is keeping our legs moving. We'll get there. And we're certainly closer now, safer, better informed, and practiced. So let's keep on. We're close. I know we'll get there together. Shana Tova.